I'm actually going to video this, and I'm going to put it together with a PowerPoint, and I'll send it in so you'll have the whole kind of package. And it's also semi-deliberate because the talk that I want to do is to use the theme of hazards to actually talk about why you should study geography at university. Not my university, any university, just why you should be studying geography. So let's get on. So I'm going to talk about the fatal attraction, the connection between humans and any kind of tectonic hazards. But I'm an earthquake geologist, that's my training, so I'll mainly be talking about earthquakes. And you'll hear a lot about earthquakes today. And what I want to do is to try to give you, call it the anatomy, get inside, under the skin of particular earthquakes, and I'll use a couple of examples for that. But we're going to start off with what looks like a pretty typical image of an earthquake. So you've got some buildings that have been shaken up and kind of collapsed, and some debris, and it's pretty easy to see those images and go, oh yeah, that's just an earthquake. And you can think of them, you can explain it in terms of, as we've heard from Duncan, the things like the P waves and the S waves and the surface waves that come in, and look at the kind of physical phenomenology, if you like, of the earthquake. But I want to get deeper, a little bit deeper than that. Let's go this. So we've also heard about this. This is the kind of plate tectonics. So here is these yellow lines that outline the boundaries of our big tectonic plates. And something like 95% of the energy of the earthquakes, 99% of the energy release in earthquakes occurs along those yellow lines. But also most of the volcanoes occur along there. Most of the tsunamis that get generated occur along those lines. You'll see in many cases it's working. You've got mountain belts like the Andes and the Western Cordillera, and even places like Japan and New Guinea, very mountainous. And so you get landslides and flooding preferentially. That's my point, is that that's the physical template of our planet. A lot of our hazard distribution can be explained, certainly geophysical, so within the Earth, can be explained by plate tectonics, less so hydrometeorological. So that's the physical bit. And it's important to understand that, and Duncan outlined really the kind of understanding the structure of the Earth and how plate tectonics works is really critical. But I'm interested particularly in disasters, so hazards that actually have a real impact on society. And if you're interested in disasters, it becomes more complicated. So you'll see various diagrams today that put this across, and Martin after me will talk about this in a lot more detail. But the bit that I've talked about is in this right-hand side. So here what we've got is the hazards, earthquakes, flooding, landslides, volcanic eruptions, etc., along with some others. Those are the physical processes that we think about. But if we're interested in disasters, there's a whole bunch of stuff on the other side. So going really to the very far, we see the really deep structural issues that are at play. And these are related to the political system that a country endures. The economic system that a country has. Moving up, there's a whole set of pressures that come from the dynamic changes within a particular nation or within a particular region. And that's things like tendencies like urbanization, so the move to the cities, or coastalization, the move to the coast, or migration of people from refugee crisis, bringing in marginalized populations, or deforestation. So these are land use kind of planning issues as a result of human changes. And then finally, we've got the development of essentially unsafe conditions locally. So that might be unsafe land, marginal land that people are forced into because they just have to, that's the only space they've got. It could be marginalized groups, poverty groups, or other kind of marginalized groups. So earthquakes and other disasters selectively, preferentially pick out the really weak parts of society, and they're often locally defined. So the point is that this idea of risk, of the risk of disaster, is a combination of hazard, the right-hand side, and vulnerability, the left-hand side. And it's really clear when you look at that you can't study disasters unless you study the physical and the human. Now, I got into geography and then geology because I didn't like human geography. I have to admit this in front of you all. And it's only in the last few years I realised what a terrible, terrible mistake that I'd made. Because actually, if you think of climate change, you think of resources, you think of water, you think of disasters, is the real understanding comes in being able to put together both of those sides. And I sometimes think in geography we suffer a little bit for this human versus physical schism, kind of break sometimes. Anyway, in terms of the physical processes, I'm not really going to say how an earthquake works. You've had this, I'm sure. There's a video a film I made for the Natural Environment Research Council called The Anatomy of an Earthquake, which is a kind of 10-minute film, that kind of animated graphic that actually goes through the physical process. It's kind of loosely based on an earthquake in Italy in 2009, but that kind of explains that physical side a lot more, so I don't want to get into that. Instead, what I'd like to talk to is a couple of examples, the places that I went to and saw things firsthand. I thought that would be more useful and more interesting to you. And one of them is Bam. Bam is in southeastern Iran, and on Christmas 2003, so almost exactly a year before the Indian Ocean tsunami in 26th of December 2004, there was an earthquake that we've kind of forgotten about in many cases, that leveled this ancient city of Bam and killed, well, we don't know how many killed, actually. It might be 30,000. We really don't know. The population of Bam was about 300,000. It's estimated it lost 10% of its population. And you can see just how kind of trashed, leveled that city is. The buildings just absolutely collapsed. And it's not really hard to think that it's been very hard to survive in those buildings. So here we are. Here's so the plate tectonic setting, really. Here's Arabia down here. We're hearing lots about that in the news. Here's the Persian Gulf. So the Arabian plate is pushing kind of northwards into Eurasia. And the boundary, really, it's a diffuse boundary over several thousand kilometres, lots and lots of earthquakes. And here's Bam down here in the area of the Lut Desert. And that's an interesting point. Here's Bam, here's a town. It's in the middle of the desert. And yet, despite this being like 50, 100 miles in any direction, you don't really find any other major settlement. The earthquake had a direct hit. And not, just to show you how direct it was, there's the town of Bam, and there is a fault line. So in the middle of the desert, wasteland all around, the fault line hit Bam absolutely directly. You think, oh, that was bad luck, wasn't it? All that space, the earthquake could have gone and hit it directly. Not only did it hit it directly, but that earthquake preferentially picked out certain parts of Bam to destroy and certain parts not to destroy. And it wasn't to do with the physical seismic waves, it was to do with what it found there. So, here are the law offices. So they're the offices where lawyers work before court cases. And you can see it's kind of bent and twisted. In fact, here's the image of the building. You can see it maybe a little bit better. You can almost sense that building being pushed and pulled, and so it's kind of contorted. But it stood up. It stood up because many of those pillars are reinforced concrete. They're reinforced by metal struts inside. So that building was designed to stay up. It's been damaged, but as far as we know, all the lawyers that worked in that office walked out of there alive. Here's a hospital. 350 people died in that hospital. It didn't have reinforced concrete, and it didn't have metal struts. And that's a pretty common, typical thing in earthquakes, because these are municipal buildings. They're paid for by the public purse. Public purse is relatively poor, so typically not much money gets spent on hospitals and schools and other these buildings. But the trouble with when you destroy a hospital is it's a triple whammy in a disaster. So first thing, the most vulnerable parts of society are in that building. Those are the injured, the old, the elderly, children that can't fend for themselves, they can't do anything, and the earthquake strikes and they die there. The second whammy is, that's where the doctors and nurses are. The doctors and nurses that you want after your disaster to go out into the field and attend the injured and etc. And then thirdly, that's where you want to take the injured after the disaster into the hospital to get them fixed. And yet, time and time again, it's not just Bam, we find that hospitals are preferentially damaged during major disasters, particularly earthquakes. So from that, we get this kind of view, this adage that we say, is it's not the earthquakes that kill people, it's the buildings. So if we want to save lives, earthquake disasters, then don't do geography, do civil engineering. Because civil engineering, you can learn to develop better buildings. So that's surely the way. So do civil engineering, you'll be better buildings, and that's all fine. I'll come back to why that's not right at the end, and why we need it to be geographers doing this, not necessarily civil engineers. But buildings are the thing that decide. So it was the people, the civic authorities, whoever decided that it was the hospital should be built in a certain way and not reinforced, and the law courts or the law offices should be built to higher standard. I said about that thing about the direct hit, and that's a little bit more complicated too. Here's BAM, here's this fault line, and you're already noticing this colour image from Google, all of this. This is irrigation. This is water that is getting tapped from the fault line, and is getting used to feed the date plantations of BAM. And that was the main economic livelihood of the city. These are world famous, these are famed throughout Iran as a really good quality date. So the point is that the water is coming out of the fault, because the fault's just a line of weakness. It's a crack in the earth. And water is leaking out permanently, and if you're going to build a settlement in the middle of the desert, you need to build it in a place where you can get persistent, reliable water. So thousands of years ago, they found spring lines coming out along this line, and that's where the city was developed. They didn't know it was a fault line, but they needed water. And there was probably a few earthquakes a few thousand years ago, and they would shake it up, and maybe a few people died, but there were very few people there, and the buildings weren't of much consequence, etc. But you zoom forward through the centuries, and you get into the 20th century, and you get into the second part of the 20th century, and you get the post-war economic boom around the world. And suddenly, villages become towns, towns become cities, cities become major cities. And so a place like BAM turns out to have several 100,000 people living on a fault line. So when that fault line moves, you can see the effects of that. And it's elsewhere. Top left, Tehran, capital of Iran, 13 million people, fault line right through the middle of Tehran for the exact same reason. That in ancient times, it was a place of persistent water supply, the sediment grew up, it's bigger. We've now got 13 million people sitting on a fault line that could move. We don't know when. Now, if that kills 10% of the population, I can let you do the figures, it's not good. And what we see really, this is just a slice through the Alpine Himalayan corridor really. So going from the Mediterranean across into Asia and across to Japan. And the blue squares are the cities. The red squares are the big lethal earthquakes that we know from history. And the brownish tones, the darker the tones, is there of what we call seismic energy release. So the darker the tones, the more the seismic energy that actually gets released. And what we see then is that many of the big killer earthquakes in history occurs in places where we now have big cities. And also we've got places where the biggest seismic strain release occur in places with cities. So in many cases, those cities are there for the very reason that I said with BAM. They've been rooted historically in fault zones, and it's never been a problem really until the 20th century, where we've just swollen in terms of the numbers and the infrastructure. It's been this urbanization, etc. And so that becomes really important. And with that becomes something else that's important. Now this graph is not so much tricky, but it's a three-dimensional plot, and the two plots that I want you to look at, the vertical plot here is, you'll see on the left-hand side, earthquake fatalities. So it's logarithmic, so it's 10, 100,000, 10,000, 100,000. So basically, the higher up the plot there is, the more fatalities that country tends to have in earthquakes. And then the right-hand side axis, the horizontal one, is the level of corruption as determined by Transparency International, which is an organisation that metrics the level of corruption within a city, within a country. So on the right-hand side, the far right-hand side is very uncorrupt, very transparent. So New Zealand is sitting there, for example, it's one of the ones. And anything to the left of that is very corrupt. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that the relationship there says that the higher the level of corruption, the higher the level of fatalities during earthquakes. And the mediator in that is buildings. Because if you've got a corrupt society in terms of a corrupt system, then you might be building buildings, but they're likely to be just signed off in a shoddy way as a result of the building codes not being respected. Someone gets bunged a few $100 and they sign off something that's not been built right, but actually that's what it does. And the only way it's found out is suddenly when the earthquake comes along 10, 20 years later and the building falls down. So corruption, chronic endemic corruption is a real problem then in many of these countries. So I want to then, that's my kind of first case study. But this second case study is one that I've been working on really ever since 1990s when I finished my PhD. Istanbul. So, an amazing city. And this is going to sound bonkers, but if you get a chance to go to Istanbul, go there. I'm not going to do the best kind of travel tourist write-up for the next few minutes, but it is the most exciting city. It's my favourite city in the world. Anyway, this is Hagia Sophia, which was a church, then a mosque, then a museum. And so it kind of looks a bit clunky. But the reason it's clunky is because of these stone buttresses that have been added over the centuries. Because this is a building that has been struck repeatedly by large damaging earthquakes over the last 1,500 years. So that building knows that Istanbul gets damaging direct strikes from earthquakes. But the city's not had a direct strike for about a couple of centuries. In those couple of centuries, that whole city beyond has basically grown up. So that larger city has never experienced a really big earthquake, and the likelihood is it's just not ready for it. But let me explain why I think we have got an earthquake threat. So, this is the tectonic situation. We get this thing called the North Anatolian Fault Line. It's kind of Europe's San Andreas. It's a strike-slip fault that allows the Anatolian platelet, or tectonic plate, to move westward. At that classic, the rate your fingernails grow. I don't know if anyone's actually ever measured the rate people's fingernails grow. I guess they have, but we always say this. The rate your fingernails grow into the Aegean with respect to the Eurasian plate. And of course, if that movement was gradual, as it is, in here it's gradual. If it was all gradual, then we wouldn't have a problem, but it's not. It's stuck and snagged, and it produces a series of earthquakes. But the pattern of earthquakes along the North Anatolian is incredible over the 20th century. Christmas 1939, we have a massive earthquake here, it ruptures this section, and then we have an earthquake that ruptures this one in 1942, 43, 44, there's a little bit fills in 51, then it continues 57, 67, and then it produces this in 1999. 17th of August, 1999, magnitude 7.4 earthquake that kills 18,000 people. You can see the buildings collapsing, pancaking down. Modern reinforced concrete buildings, modern buildings. And then here's Istanbul. And actually further to the west, there's another section that went in a big earthquake in 1912. What that means is that this plate boundary structure, the entire length has ruptured in the last 100 years except for one segment. That red segment in here. And that segment is called the Prince's Island segment. It's tricky because it's offshore, it's in the sea, the waters of the Marmara Sea. But we can see you might be able to spot there's a kind of seabed scar, a cliff line there, an escarpment, that's the fault line. But the chances are when it ruptures, it will cause seabed to move, so it will be tsunamigenic, it's going to produce a tsunami. We've got a long historical record of damaging tsunamis in the Marmara Sea. This is where the 99 rupture ended. So we think that that is the section that's ready to go. And the length of that suggests that it will be a magnitude 7.4 at least earthquake. It could be larger, but the kind of modest expectation is a magnitude 7.4, so equivalent to the one that struck Izmir. And the worry is that 20 kilometers to the north is this. A city of 15 million people. Now, I say this to pretty much every audience that I talk to, but you're an easy audience to say this to. You will see Istanbul struck with a major earthquake in your lifetime. It's almost inconceivable that that segment of the North Anatolian Fault will not rip during a large earthquake, because the tectonic strain is built up, and that's the only bit. And we've got a record of earthquakes going back 2,000 years for Constantinople, then Istanbul. An amazing record. It's one of the best records on the planet. So the question then is, all right, that's what geology's done. That's what the physical bit's done. The question is, what do we do about it? So, what are they doing about it? Well, they are preparing the city. They did it in various ways. There is, so there's any new bridges that's there are built to, those magnitude 8 probably standards. There's an urban metro system in, and that's designed. There's a whole set of sensors across the city. There's early warning cut-offs on many of the power stations and gas plants, etc. So it's not that people are not taking this lightly. But there's also a massive construction projects looking at the city itself. So that view there is of a transformation, an urban transformation process that's happening, which is ripping down and knocking down the old kind of infirm buildings and communities in Istanbul that have kind of sprung up semi-illegally, knocking them down and building new modern buildings that are designed to withstand earthquakes. And you think, fantastic, of course that's exactly what we should do. So this is the urban renewal. 2 laws came in that gave this, the civic authorities gave permission for districts to be knocked down because of the earthquake threat. The people that were living there either moved into these new buildings, about a third of them did. Many of them that they couldn't afford to were put out on satellite cities around the wider area. So that increases the seismic safety of the buildings, but actually people are really angry. A lot of people are really angry about this process, this urban renewal process. And at first you think, well, that's odd. Why? Surely they should be really pleased that something's getting done for this momentous threat that these geoscientists have said is kind of hanging over them. So to kind of understand what's going on, you need to go into the psyche of people that are living in those places. Now, this is a nice study, and I guess an indication of where earth science is going. It's actually studied by a bunch of psychologists that are about 400 yards from here at UCL. So these are environmental psychologists that have worked on what is in the psyche of people when we talk about earthquakes. And they compared Western USA, Turkey, which is red, and Japan. And there are some similarities. So, for example, these are just the units with which the responses in the interviews. A high degree of fatalism. What that means is, in all 3 areas, the people go, what can you do? A high degree of awareness. They know, in each of those 3 areas, they know they're living in earthquake country. They're not ignorant of it, they're not stupid. In Istanbul, they saw it 1999. The house is exactly like theirs, pancake down, lots of people killed, there's no hiding place. Other ones, well, what are the differences? Well, I don't know if you could see this. In Turkey, there is a religious component, so there is a sense that earthquakes might be acts of God. But the one that turns out to be the real critical one is this one right at the end, which is in Turkey a much higher propensity to think of earthquakes, or at least the disasters of earthquakes, as acts of people. That somehow it's the people that have created the disaster. Now, to understand that, we have to drill in a little bit more to the values that people have got underneath. So this is also from that same group. And it's a little bit messy on the left-hand side. I'm not got time to go into this in detail. I'm going to look at the right-hand side where you can see the red Turkey one, much different from Western USA or from Japan. First one, a demise of identity. It's a tricky one to explain this. It came out of the interviews with people kind of feeling that the country was going down the tubes, that there was a degeneration within the country, that it was going to the dogs. And anyone who knows Turkey knows there's a huge political and cultural and social turmoil going on within that nation. And we get a hint of some of this when we go to the next one. A high level of perceived corruption. And actually, it's not perceived. Transparency International has got Turkey as really elevated levels of chronic, endemic corruption. Then we have blaming of businesses. Private enterprise has been running the show. a blaming of the state, the civic authorities, the city government as not doing enough, and a high level of distrust, and therefore a high level of anger about the whole process. So these protests here in the streets are about protesting against the urban renewal process when bulldozers were going in to knock down the old communities, and this was those people in those communities protesting against that process. Why were they protesting against something that was going to increase seismic security? And well, this is one of the districts where they're doing this and knocking down the old one, and some people are okay about it. Here's Sedat. Sedat says, you know, we've been living here for 30 years. It used to be a football field, it was open ground. And then there was this process of urban transformation. So people were taken to these new buildings that were safer for earthquakes. Yeah, it used to be nothing. It used to be open ground. The reason it was open ground in that area is because the soil is rubbish. It's really poor soil, lots of water in it, shakes, it's going to be prone to liquefaction and accentuated shaking. So it's not good ground for building on, which is why it was never built on. But now we're building these new safer earthquake buildings in that area because that's the area that's got high risk. Here's Ali in a different district. Ali has a very different view. He's really suspicious. He says, look, we don't have any information. No one tells us anything. We think the earthquake is an excuse. He says, the term earthquake doesn't point to the real thing. The real thing is they just want to acquire a very precious land. Okmedani district is a low-income, immigrant area, high crime rate, but it's got fantastic views down to the Golden Horn, which is what all the tourists are going to want to see. So it's very well positioned in the city, but it's got very low kind of land values. But this area up here, this interchange, is the last main interchange in Istanbul that doesn't have luxury apartments and luxury malls. So what Ali says is, you know, he says in the 99 earthquake, where thousands of buildings were damaged across the city, not a single crack in Okmedani. I reckon, he says, they just want to knock down our buildings so they can put up fancy buildings for themselves and earn loads of profit. Because all this new urban transformation is driven by private enterprise. It's not public money that's paying for this. The civic authorities brought in a law allowing private companies to do this, to knock it down, to build fancy new buildings. So on those buildings, we're back in Zittenburno here. Here's the buildings that were getting knocked down. Of course that's going to fall down during an earthquake. You could probably push it down. These are the new ones. But the only way you can make that work is by making them big enough to have lots more people in so that you get your profit margin. Because these are for relatively low, modest income families. So the irony is, this is driven by private companies, putting more people into these buildings in an area which was never designed to be built on in the first place. All to satisfy the earthquake risk. Now here's the thing. They may well be built to withstand earthquakes. Do you know why Sedat, who now lives in one of these, thinks that they're built to withstand earthquakes? Because he's given a big piece of paper signed off by an engineer telling him that it's designed to withstand earthquakes. But of course, in a city where there's rampant corruption, it's hard to accept that entirely. The acid test of whether those buildings will stand up will be the next Istanbul earthquake. And if they've been built well, fantastic, they've saved loads of lives. But if they've been built shoddily and they collapse, far more people are now living in this high-risk area than were there before. So this is the complexity of what happened. So as a geologist, I thought my role was to identify where there were earthquake faults, where there were danger zones. But the point is, by doing that, we kind of unleash a whole process. And it's that whole collective process that is the problem. It's very multifaceted, it's messy. And it's really understanding that mess that it relies on. If you're interested, we haven't written most of this up, but I've got a PhD student who is a visual filmmaker, a visual anthropologist, and I'm not going to go into the background of all this, but she's made so one of the problems is how do you reach the information to people on the ground? Because although people know about earthquakes, they don't do very much in the way of preparedness for a whole bunch of reasons. So this is a video not aimed at you guys passing your A-level, it's aimed at people in Istanbul, so there's a Turkish version, there's an English version, but you might be interested in that. I'm going back to this. So this was the image we started with. This is in the centre of this is a primary school. 304 primary school kids died in that building. If you look to the left and to the right, you'll see office blocks untouched by the earthquake. So in the 21st century, through these advances in science and technology, we can build office blocks to withstand earthquakes, but not schools or hospitals. And that is patently wrong. It's patently unfair. So I said that if you were interested that earthquakes don't kill, buildings kill, and I said, right, if you're following that logic, go off and be civil engineers. This is why it doesn't work to go off and do civil engineering. Because the civil engineer will build that building if they're told to, or that building if they're told to. Instead, the real issue are these complex issues about engineering and science and technology on one hand, and how it fits with governance and corruption and the political system on the other one. And as you know, that is geography. It's pushing those two things that's essentially geography. So I'm going to finish really with this image here, which I think is the problem that we face in the next few decades. So in 2015, the United Nations developed this thing called the Sendai Framework. We may hear more about it for disaster risk reduction, which is kind of a manual for how the planet needs to deal with reducing the risk of deaths from disasters. It's got a lot of science and technology, but it's also got a lot of behavioural change. It's kind of a mixture of psychology and sociology and all that. It's essentially a lesson plan in geography. And here's this image really is, there's only two things on that image. The cities, the major population centres of the world, which are in the squares, and then the seismic strain release. So there's no plate boundaries or anything. So the darker those tones is where the biggest earthquake energy release is. Now, not all the cities lie on those high areas of high seismic strain, but a lot of them do. So this is going to be one of the biggest challenges that's coming, alongside things like climate change, water resources, energy, the transition to the low energy, renewable future. These are huge, huge, messy, complex challenges. But they'll be the defining challenges for our society. So I say this to you, this is the last word really. You're smart people, you're all smart, that's why you're here today. And you're going to go off to uni, and there'll be a mixture of stuff that you're all doing. And some of you want to go off to do medicine, and law, and maths, and all engineering, all sorts of fantastic things to do. But if you're not going to do geography, then you better hope people smarter than you are. Because I think these are some of the hardest problems that we're going to have to face. And we need the best people thinking about that to do it. So thanks very much. Thank you.